talked about the grid architecture before, a grid architecture which is over 100 years old. And that grid architecture was never designed for intermittent resources or distributed resources. And we've been bolting on to the grid renewables and distributed resources, and again, never designed for those resources. And so in IT terms, I guess, the grid today, that architecture is the mainframe, and we really want to have a grid architecture that looks more like the IT system of today, which is a mix of the mainframe and distributed solutions. So the current grid has large power plants that pushes electrons in one direction, and as you said before, produces based upon the, what's forecasted for the next day, depending on weather. Mm-hmm. And it's electrons only flow in one direction, and so that's a very inefficient system. I mean, as an example, in New York State, the average capacity utilization of the grid is 54%. And that means it's built for the hottest couple of days of the year, but customers pay for it all year long. So one of the ways to think about balancing the load and improving the average capacity utilization is to have these distributed nodes, and a distributed node would be a virtual power plant. I mean, one of the challenges with distributed solutions is we know that they're almost always good for the host customers. The question is it good for all customers?
And that's the opportunity as Jigar Shah, the current Loan Program Office Director of DOE, thinks about virtual power plants, is to see this enormous opportunity of aggregating distributed resources and providing effective solutions for the bulk power grid at the right place at the right time, and that's nominally through a mixture of distributed hardware assets, but a very complex software platform. Is that the way to think about it?
Yes, and you talked about a key word, which is location, because location really matters.
So how does that play out?
Well, I think if you think about the grid as pushing electrons like water, there are some parts of the grid which have constraints in the pipes, as it were. Mm-hmm. And these are often in urban areas, but not always. And so the challenge of the traditional grid architecture is trying to push electrons from far away into these really constrained areas of the grid. And the optimal place for a virtual power plant is going to be inside of one of those areas of grid constraint. And in that case, it not only helps those customers, and then not only will it be more resilient, not only will it be cleaner, but it'll provide services to the rest of the grid, because the grid won't have to work as hard to push electrons into those areas of constraint.
So kind of given all of those dynamics of what's happening both on the hardware side, the software side, we talked a little bit about load shifting and storage, software opportunities. How should a CEO be thinking about this complex environment, and how should they be talking to their teams and their investors and their innovation partners about that innovation landscape and allocating resources for both near-term opportunities as well as investing for medium and longer term?
Well, if I can just sort of pull the camera back a little bit. I mean, we talked about the average capacity utilization of the system. I think, again, if we look at the whole system, we have a system which is really energy inefficient. Mm-hmm. I don't know, how would you guess how inefficient is?
Losses on the order of 40% overall, I would say, give or take about the grid utilization of New York, yeah.
Okay, so it's energy inefficient, but as an old finance guy, it's really financially inefficient. So that 54% capacity utilization, I would compare that to other capital-intensive industries that, because of global competition, have had to adopt new technology, change in their financial incentives and business models that now operate 80 or 90% capacity utilization. So we may not like traveling sometimes in airplanes, because the airline industry now operates around 90% capacity utilization, but it's much cheaper to fly coast to coast than it used to be. And when we talk about a complex system that involves safety, you know, that's you'd have to say the airline industry is comparable to or has a lot of similarities to people's concern about the electric utility system. And so the reason why the electric utility industry can operate or has operated at this low capacity utilization is because it's been protected by, I guess I'll call it the golden cage of regulation. And so if you pay a business based upon how much capital it deploys, we can't be surprised that it uses a lot of capital. And the reason why I mention all this is because if we keep pursuing an approach for decarbonization that involves adding more and more renewables onto the grid architecture that was not designed for these resources, that capacity utilization is going to go down, not up. And it means that it's going to become more and more expensive to provide electricity services to customers. And that's a real challenge because it means those customers that can afford to have their own energy systems will do so, leaving the cost of the rest of the system borne over fewer customers, which will lead to more customer erosion. So this, I think, poses a challenge not just to the traditional utility business model, but also to those customers that are on the grid and whether they're going to be able to get electricity at competitive rates.
There's also another component, as I just listened to you, is really about the whole theme that is now front and center in front of us, which is energy and environmental justice. Right? So if I'm hearing you correctly, continuing down this traditional capital-intensive and inefficient pathway has unjust consequences if it's not rethought and reapproached. And so from a state leader perspective or even a corporate perspective where you really want to take care of everyone in your jurisdiction, and particularly think about public utility commissions, and we can get back to the role of utility commissions, they have to think differently about programs and take advantage of what's available in the federal system right now with the incentives and the approach to energy justice, and think about how to creatively support low and middle income communities and have them as part of this energy transition. Is that also on top of your mind?
Well, yes, in a couple of different ways. I mean, I think when I talked before about customers leaving the system and leaving other customers behind, those customers that have access to technical and financial resources are going to be the first ones that are going to leave, leaving the cost of the system on those that are more and more vulnerable. So it has that dynamic has equity implications. But beyond that, we also need to talk about the way that we have often funded clean energy support programs at the state level, which has been a surcharge on customer utility bills. And when you consider the fact that poor people have spend a higher percentage of their income on utilities than richer people, it's effectively a regressive tax. So I kind of want to go back to this issue of when we talk about rethinking things. If we already have a system which is financially inefficient, we have to get more out of what we're already spending on bills as opposed to trying to support clean energy programs by putting a surcharge on bills.